Please be seated. Friends, it's always interesting for me to introduce one of my brother Oblates because it's like introducing one of my brothers, and that's always a hard thing to do sometimes. But Father Tom Dailey, this is the second time Father Tom has been here this year. I invited Father Tom to speak at our parish retreat, our parish staff retreat at the beginning of the school year for our faculty and our parish staff. Father Tom, as you can see and read, is an oblate of St. Francis de Sales, and I'm just going to share one little story about Father Tom before I invite him up here. Father Tom taught me. So he's much older than I am. But I can say this, he taught me when I was in college. And it was one of the best classes that I had. And so, without further ado, I'd like to invite my brother Oblate, Father Tom Dailey.
So, relationships. We all have them. We all need them. We all want them. And we know how beneficial they are. Yet, at one time or another, we've probably all messed them up. Welcome to life. And welcome here to the inaugural Live Jesus Conference in Pennsylvania, which this year explores the possibility of healing relationships, if and when we let it begin with me. I'm honored to begin your day with this talk, despite my old age. But I do have to apologize to the planners of the conference because I am going to change the title with just a little bit. And don't worry, I'm not going to ditch the whole theme. But I'm hoping that the different starting point I intend to give will actually help generate the hoped-for outcome that drew you here to this conference today. To be sure, relationships are absolutely central to who we are and who we are to become. In fact, they matter so much that our Christian faith is grounded in a relationship. God entered into one with us personally in the Nativity in order to redeem and save our relationship eternally through the Paschal mystery we are about to celebrate. Indeed, the forging of relationship is what sweeps across the arc of time. The one who created us did so out of a relationship of Trinitarian love, and did so for the purpose of uniting us in a relationship with the Trinity forever. Now, that's a really big picture. We might also think of it as the picture frame within which we need to see the picture of our own relationships, even, or especially, the ones in need of healing. That picture frames the worldview of Salesian spirituality. That's how you say the word, Salesian spirituality. An approach to human flourishing that is fundamentally relational in nature and in scope. This relational worldview offers a guiding perspective for us, one that serves as a presupposition to everything else that I'm going to say today. In the visionary thought of St. Francis de Sales, we live in a world of interconnected hearts. An image that Wendy Wright explains very well in one of her works, when she says, "For the Savoyard bishop, all human hearts were created to beat in rhythm with their Creator's dynamic, creative, and generative heart. Because human hearts are created by God, who is goodness and love itself, they too are essentially good and always retain their original orientation to love. Yet, as they are wounded by sin, human hearts are, as it were, arrhythmic and must be restored to their intended pulse by living Jesus. They do this through the mediation of the one heart that is both fully human and fully divine. The heart of Jesus must be exchanged for human hearts. So, living Jesus, it's what we do. It's what we do when we heal relationships. And I'd like to suggest today that we can do that. We can heal relationships when we let it begin, not with me, but with the wisdom of St. Francis de Sales. A wisdom born of his own experience and set forth for us in his timeless teaching. To explain this little change in the focus, my talk is going to have two parts, structured in terms of gift and response. The first part builds the foundation in terms of the saint's profound conversion experience. For that, we're going to take a look back to his time as a student in Paris and the relational gift he received at the feet of the Black Madonna. The second part then radiates outward from that experience in terms of the saint's example and teaching. And for that part, we'll take a look at four little virtues. Well, actually, it's one virtue with four aspects that offer a distinctly Salesian response to healing the various relationships we have. Hopefully, the two parts will go together and make some sense, but at the very least, you can keep track of the four virtues and count them, and then you'll know when I'm near the end. So the first part, the foundation. The Salesian call to live Jesus is more than a motto, more than a catchphrase for a desirable code of conduct. In fact, in terms of marketing, the What Would Jesus Do campaign sold a lot more items. To live Jesus is to enter into the gift-response dynamic at the very core of the Christian life. In Jesus, the divine will bringing about creation, the incarnation, and the paschal mystery is the gift. Our choice to live in faith and hope and charity is the response. Fair enough? Fair enough? All right. Because that's about as theologically heavy as I'm going to get. I'm going to presume that you agree with that without too much more explanation. But a young St. Francis de Sales did try to understand that, particularly when he sought to grasp what it really meant in and for his own life. That youthful endeavor takes us back to his days as a student in 16th century Paris and the conversion experience that would impact him then and there and for the rest of his life. What I propose to you today is that the same experience gives us the proper starting point for healing relationships in the 21st century. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the famous episode during a decade that this saint spent in Paris. If not, his biographers can offer you all the details. Rather than retelling the whole story, I would simply like to focus our attention on the profound change that takes place in the protagonist and in the singularly important relationship at the heart of his story and of ours too. Consider that at the time in Paris, Francis de Sales has not been acclaimed a saint or doctor of the church. Not yet. He's just a teenager. A young lad who had left his quaint village home years before at the age of 12, in the quest for an education that would prepare him for a noble life. And that would happen, but in ways that neither he nor his parents could ever imagine. Life at the court of high society in Paris was everything you might imagine it to be. For young people there, the big city presented a throng of new and sometimes wild experiences as they learned to sing the pleasures of drinking and hunting and loving. Surely, Francis's mother did not bring him up to live that way. Nor, I suspect, did ours. Yet we too have to confront the ways of a world often at odds with what is good and right. For better or worse, our environment impacts all our relationships. Back to Paris. There, as a still young soul, Francis DeSales was not yet spiritually mature. Surely he knew his own temperament, with its flashes of anger, which showed itself in more than one sword fight he got into. Likewise, his growing self-awareness must have included the real experience of facing temptations and dealing with the weaknesses of the flesh that affect every young man. And it once led his companions to trick him to going to a house of ill repute. To control himself, it's likely that young Francis took refuge in the pious exercises he learned at home and in the penitential disciplines he imposed upon himself. But none of it seemed to help. The gnawing reality of his own humanness would not give way to his craving for holiness. How disillusioned, even scandalized, he must have felt. But we know that's real. We know the effort it takes to live each day well in the sight of God and those we love, as well as the frustration that follows when we fail in those relationships or when they fail us. Influenced by the enchanting world around him, and enticed by the emerging passions within him, as we all are, Francis DeSales sought guidance in the surety of his faith as taught by the Church. But in Paris, even that became a source of conflict for him. Taking in some theological lectures at the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, he sat through raging disputation of predestination, in which it seemed even Catholic thinkers claimed that God was free to decide who among us was to suffer the pangs of eternal damnation. Yet there Francis also learned the poetry of the Canticle of Canticles, with its biblical portrayal of God as joining with humanity in the historical unfolding of love. How confused this young student must have been. And we too know the challenge of faith formation. Nowadays, religious thinking is as liberal or conservative or progressive or traditionalists raise their voices with exclusive claims to orthodoxy and strident signaling of guilt. Amid the cacophony, relationships within and beyond the church suffer. And so we come to the low point in Francis's life, a point at which his most cherished relationship, the one he had and sought with God, seems to be in jeopardy. He himself admits becoming convinced in mind and heart and soul, that he was among the number destined for hell. Fixated somewhat obsessively on the idea of being for all eternity the enemy of God, as one of his confidants would later describe it, the young man of God was unable to eat or to sleep with any regularity for months. We do know what happened next. One day he stopped at the church of Saint Etienne de Graille, and there, kneeling in desperate prayer before the statue of the Black Madonna, he spoke thus: "Whatever may happen, O God, you who hold all things in your hand, whose ways are justice and truth, whatsoever you may have decreed concerning me in the eternal secret of your predestination and reprobation, you whose judgments are unfathomable, you who are ever just judge and merciful Father, I will love you always, O Lord, at least in this life. At least in this life will I love you, if it is not given to me to love you in eternity." And then he dutifully recited the Memorare in its entirety. And when he finished praying, the crisis was over. The despair had passed. The obsession had subsided. As St. Jane de Chantal recounts the moment, his troubles, so it seemed to him, had fallen about his feet like a leper's scales. Now, whatever its exact cause, the crisis in Paris would prove to be a spiritual conversion for young Francis. It awakened in him a profound awareness of the generosity of God. It made real for him what St. Paul writes in his letter to the Ephesians about the grace of God, when he says, "In Jesus and through his blood, we have been redeemed, and our sins forgiven. So immeasurably generous is God's favor to us." This experience sealed within Francis a new spirit, such that he would now take hold of his relationship with God and never let go. His prayer of abandonment reflects and reveals a change within him, the change within him. No longer would he pursue his relationship with God by way of emotional fervor or pious devotions or intellectual acumen, though we know he possessed all three. Rather, he learned to overcome his saintly craving for God by transcending it completely. And as a result, he also changed his perspective on worldly relationships. He knows now that God's love for human beings, personally, not just conceptually, that love surpasses the transitory ups and downs of our existence. Based on his experience, Francis forms a thoroughly hopeful worldview that would inform all his relationships and all his works. He would live by and teach an optimism that exalted the goodness of life not as the result of our human accomplishments or even the worthiness of human nature, but as the very real effect of a true understanding of divine mercy. And it's there, in that fundamental optimism born of his spiritual experience, that we find the firm foundation for healing relationships. We let it begin with God, whose generous mercy toward us and gracious love for us, before anything we ever do gives us the wherewithal to approach our relationships in an entirely new way. And I think we can also let it begin with St. Francis de Sales. His mind and heart and soul were healed in Paris by abandoning himself entirely to the God revealed in sacred scripture, and particularly by the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And so in turn, he teaches us to live Jesus by radiating a similar cordiality in all our relationships. To the practice of this all-encompassing virtue, let us now turn our attention. So in this second part of the talk, I want to focus on a distinctly Salesian approach to human relationships. I say distinctly Salesian because I intend the term cordiality to refer to a habit of the devout life, a little virtue that we can and should cultivate in order to live Jesus, and not merely a personality trait with which someone may or may not be endowed. Arising from the generosity of God's love and embodied for us in the Sacred Heart of Jesus, cordiality here refers both to a disposition and an action toward others. It is a thinking from and living from the heart. Cordiality. Thinking from and living by the heart. In the tradition of Salesian spirituality, the heart is understood not as a center of emotion, but as the core of being human. As Father Andre Brix describes it, St. Francis de Sales saw the heart as the human being taken integrally, body and soul, in an indissociable unity. The heart, in other words, is also the deepest me, and our mask, or better, our person, who by way of the heart is known and recognized. Cordiality is the virtue that expresses the convictions of our hearts. As such, it gives shape to the way we approach every relationship. And in my view, it also holds the key to how we can heal relationships as well. To show you how that could work, I would simply like to introduce 4 different instances in which this distinctly virtue comes into play. So now you can start counting. And each of these is characterized by a particular aspect of cordiality that we could practice in our own relationships. So first, the first instance goes back to the beginning. Relationships have to start somewhere. And the first moment of encountering another person is critical to what may later develop into a relationship. Common wisdom, with some science behind it, claims that a first impression is formed in just 7 seconds. We all know the logic that dictates that we don't get a second chance to make a first impression. The gentleman saint, Francis de Sales, knew this very well. Keenly aware of human psychology, really a humanistic anthropology, he understood that inner dispositions make themselves known outwardly, in and through the way we present ourselves to and the way we encounter other people. And so not long after his stay in Paris, Francis de Sales penned for himself a set of spiritual exercises, what we commonly call the rule of Padua, that included a code to guide his own conduct with other people. Moved by his own experience of the generosity of God in his regard there at Paris, he determined to engage with others in a way that reflected a generous disposition toward them. here's the rule that he made up for himself. I will never disdain meeting any person, no matter who they may be, nor will I show any sign of wishing to avoid them, for this earns one the reputation of being proud, haughty, unfeeling, arrogant, snobbish, ambitious, and manipulative. Above all, I will be careful neither to criticize, nor to mock, nor to be sarcastic to anyone. It is a sign of stupidity, he says, to make fun of those who have no reason to put up with such treatment. I will show great respect for all. This exercise in making a first impression shows that Francis understood how heartfelt disdain or uncharitable speech can harm any potential relationship even before it has a chance to develop. For this reason, he chooses to show great respect at the outset, a choice that radiates from his own heart rather than from any knowledge of the other person, whom he's just meeting for the first time. If a healthy relationship is to develop, it will begin with cordiality as its first principle. Showing that same cordiality, that heartfelt respect for the other in attitude and in action, is something any of us can do. Any of us can do this to initiate and sustain a relationship. We can, if we so choose, make our first encounter with others an experience of niceness instead of nastiness. How we acknowledge others, whether and how we speak to them, even non-verbally, and what we think of them in those first 7 seconds. All of that depends more on us than on them. We all have the ability to choose to be cordial or not. And when it comes to healing relationships subsequently harmed for whatever reason, that same phenomenon of niceness can still characterize our interactions. It may first require an apology, if the hurt came from me, so that we can start over with the impression-making process. But whether giving or receiving an apology, and even without one, we are always free to choose the way of cordiality, of simply being nice to someone else, just because it's a good thing, just because it's a God thing. Let being nice begin with me. Even with a cordial start or restart, we know that growing in relationships does not depend entirely on me. Another person is equally involved. And wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, argument ensues. Unfortunately, disagreement today often degenerates into disagreeableness. Now I know it may be hard to imagine that other people might not like who we are, or how we think, or what we do. But it does happen. Still, even a relationship marked by discord can be healed with cordiality, understood in this second instance as intentional pleasantness. Pleasantness, in this sense, does not simply mean being chippy or cheerful. A merry mode of interacting will not, on its own, magically remove all disagreement. In fact, the opposite can happen. If you've ever encountered someone who actually gets calmer during an argument, which infuriates me more. But for St. Francis de Sales, choosing deliberately to be pleasant to others is within our power. That affability radiates from the heart and can act like a balm to soothe a potentially disagreeable relationship. As a virtue, this form of cordiality mediates between an excessive seriousness that can appear impersonable and an affectatious flattery that comes off as annoyingly false. The potential that pleasantness holds for healing relationships is perhaps most clearly demonstrated in the spirit and method with which St. Francis de Sales undertook his mission to the Chablais region. In that missionary work, in a land subjected to religious heresy and political persecution, back when they took church seriously, he deliberately chose to approach his religious opponents with cordiality, as several Salesian scholars have affirmed. André Ravier, for instance, notes that he treated with respect and charity even those Protestants who kept away from him, who sometimes insulted him or assailed him, and above all, he took them seriously. Or as Elizabeth Stott points out, he never talked down to the elders, never attacked them personally, addressing them as separated brothers, which was an unheard of courtesy in that age of fierce polemics. What I propose is that we make that same spirit and method our mission. It won't be a risky one. It doesn't require travel to a foreign land, nor will it involve us in religious arguments. Well, for the most part. But it is a challenge because it goes against our natural inclination to self-defense. Being pleasant toward others and doing so deliberately as a step toward healing relationships is a choice that we can make. A choice to affirm the personhood of the other over and above our differences. A choice radiating from our own hearts, which have been affirmed and redeemed by the transcendent grace and generosity that God shows towards us. So let that choice for cordiality over conflict begin with me. Hopefully, our relationships will not be too conflictual. But even amid close and familiar relationships, like those of friends or siblings or even spouses, we routinely see one conflict in need of healing. A conflict easily created by just a single word, the should word. As when we believe that the other person should or should not think or say or do what she thought or said or did. It's a common malady in many relationships, the failure to live up to expectations. We place them on others just as they place them on us, but rarely are those expectations fulfilled to anyone's satisfaction. What will be, may be popular as a song, but in a relationship, when what is not as we think it should be, and when we ascribe responsibility for that defect to the other person, we find ourselves in a jam. In many dealings with people, and in his writings about dealing with people, St. Francis de Sales often encountered the should problem. He saw it as a problem of judgment. The healing he proposes in this third instance brings us to another dimension of cordiality, which shows itself in neighborliness. Neighbors are those who are near to us, whether geographically or spiritually. To be neighborly is to relate to another in such a way that he or she is close by, is one of our own, a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler. The command to love your neighbor means to be good to and to do good by those journeying through life with you. For Francis DeSales, fulfilling that command begins with not making the kind of judgments that follow from the should word. The ultimately self-centered reasoning that thinks we know not only what is right for ourselves, but what is right for other people too. Can we never pass judgment on our neighbor? He asks in the introduction to the Devout Life. No, never, he says. For it is a rash judgment to draw a conclusion from an action in order to condemn the person. In that same devotional classic, he also offers some insightful yet challenging ways to think of others in a neighborly way. For example, he writes, if an action has many different aspects, we must always think of the one which is the best. And if an action is such that we cannot explain the fact of it or the intention behind it, he exhorts us to at least make it worthy of compassion by attributing the most favorable cause we can to it, such as ignorance or weakness. That's cordiality at work. Thinking from the heart more so than from the head. It's neighborliness, to look upon others in a way that acknowledges who they actually are, rather than demanding that they should be different. It's how acquaintances learn to become friends. It's how spouses can consent to life with each other for better or worse. Ultimately, it's how our merciful God looks upon each of us. That's a cordiality that can heal relationships. Let this love of neighbor begin with me. Sadly, the love of neighbor seems to be in short supply these days. We know all too well the deadly violence that pervades our cities, our country, our world. We see the discord, rancor, and even hatred that spews forth so easily on social media. We even witness division in the church, where the outrage to which society seems to be addicted has created a narrative of us versus them, and risks turning the church militant into the church belligerent, as Father Paul Scalia cleverly describes it. Healing relationships in this collective dimension, in community and society, in the church and in the world, calls forth the fourth and final aspect of cordiality, one that is actually its own little virtue. St. Francis de Sales calls it douceur, which we translate as gentleness or meekness. In the Salesian tradition, that little virtue comes to living expression in the religious order of the Visitation of Holy Mary, founded by St. Francis de Sales, together with St. Jane de Chantal, in 1610. I'll assume you know a little bit about this innovative religious community, formed and united in the bond of love, whose monasteries remain even in our midst today. There's still one in Philadelphia, right beside St. Joe's University. What I'd like to highlight is how that religious order models cordiality as a healing antidote to our social relationships, and brings my exploration of the conference theme full circle. In his historical study of religious culture at the time of St. Francis de Sales and St. Jane, Tom Donlan explores how the wars of religion, which is what the period was known for, led also to a violent turn in French Catholicism. He shows how religious zeal turned militant and gave rise to a strident belligerence toward Protestant reformers. It's almost as we grew up in school, right? There was the Catholics and the Protestants. Right? A huge division between them. Even among Catholics in Francis's day, opposing viewpoints made faith relationships susceptible to mortal conflict. Donlan argues, quite convincingly, that the spirituality championed by St. Francis de Sales constituted an effective critique to such religious militancy. Seen in this societal context, the founding of the Visitation Order gave life to a gentle force in a violent world. Embodying the optimistic spirituality of the founders, these new nuns would form a community of cordial love, manifesting that virtue especially through the meekness of the sisters' relationships with one another and with others outside the monastery. In imitation of the biblical mystery that gave them their name, the Visitation, they were to become what Helene Bord describes as the path, the self-same sign of the Church throughout the ages in its movement towards the realization of God's intent for the world. The sign that the Visitation Order was to be marks what Donlan calls a milestone in the spiritual transformation of Francis de Sales. The young lad, who before his conversion in Paris had himself spoken of his Catholic faith as militant and triumphant, came to believe that the Church existed only to carry the gentle Jesus and to carry him gently. His founding with Jane de Chantal of a religious congregation committed to a life of meekness brings the Salesian witness of cordial relationality to its culmination. But that virtue doesn't end with the Visitation Sisters. The movement toward a world of interconnected hearts continues with us as we strive in our societal and ecclesial relationships to practice cordiality as meekness. Doing so doesn't make us soft or wishy-washy. On the contrary, it entails and expresses a great strength of heart. It's hard to be gentle. But from a heart fortified by the grace to see others as God sees them, it's possible. When we remember that they, like us, are imperfect, yet worthy, having personal flaws, yet also possessing inherent dignity. Let that meekness of heart begin with me. Let me conclude then with a little story, a modified version of a myth recounted by Dr. M. Scott Peck, a well-known psychiatrist who aligns scientific inquiry and religious belief in his best-selling books. The story is called The Rabbi's Tale. This is the short version of it. There was a monastery in Europe, the top of a mountain, great big monastery. You know why they build monasteries on mountaintops, right? Because you're closer to God. You don't have to pray as loud. Anyway. Beautiful monastery that had been the life center of the whole village, the whole town. But after years of decline, it was falling apart. There were only 3 monks left: the abbot, the cook, and the gardener. People never came to visit anymore. The 3 were worried it was over. And so the abbot went into town to visit the well-known rabbi, have dinner with him. He told the other two he was going. And they went and they had dinner, and it was very pleasant and a good evening, and they didn't talk much about the monastery. But at the end, the abbot said, Rabbi, you know that this glorious monastery is in complete disrepair, falling apart. Do you have any advice? The rabbi said, I have no idea what to do. But remember something. One among you is God. And he said, good night. The abbot walked back up to the monastery trying to figure this out. The other two monks asked him the next day, what advice did the rabbi give to save the monastery? The abbot said, I have no idea. All he said to me was, one among you is God. And the three went their separate ways. And the gardener thought to himself, it's not me. It's not the abbot, because he's just mean. Maybe it's the cook. And the next day he complimented the cook for breakfast. And the cook said to himself, it's not me. I'm not really a gourmet chef or anything. It's not the abbot, because he's just mean. Maybe it's the gardener. So at dinner, he complimented him on the beautiful flowers. The abbot said to himself, well, it's not me, because every once in a while I'm mean. It's not the cook, because it's really not very good. I guess maybe it's the gardener. So he too complimented the gardener. And each of them, thinking it might be the other, they started to be nice to one another, and talk to one another, compliment one another, be kind to one another. And the whole mood of the place changed. It came alive, and people noticed. And the rabbi came from downtown up to the monastery with crowds of people once again celebrating. And he looked at the abbot and said, yep, one among you is God. The moral of that story, the bottom line and my last set of lines, is this. Relationships begin within, in the heart that connects us as human beings to the others with whom we interact. How our hearts see is what St. Francis de Sales learned through his conversion experience in Paris. What he lived in his own way, and what he taught in his works of spiritual direction. A heart that sees the presence of God in others beats with a rhythm of being nice, being pleasant, being neighborly, and being meek. Those expressions of cordiality may not sound all that impressive, but that's the nature of a little virtue. And such little virtues may not seem sufficient for healing relationships or changing the world, but they work, as the saintly tradition of Salesian spirituality has shown for centuries. And if I haven't convinced you, I hope Sister Anne Elizabeth's talk will do a better job. In any case, I invite you to see for yourself. Live Jesus by appreciating the gift of God's generous mercy in your own life, and by cultivating the virtue of cordiality toward others as a response to that divine gift. when we do, when we let that begin with each of us, healing will happen. May God be blessed.